Well, thank you so much for coming in today, doing this interview. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So starting off, what motivated you to come to Elon today?
Well, I was invited to come to give a memorial lecture tonight, which is related to issues of domestic violence and violent extremism is the work that I do, and its connection to domestic violence and gender-based violence. And we used that in my research lab as a kind of anchor to bring a team down. So we've been in North Carolina all week doing trainings across public and private universities around online manipulation and social media harms.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what motivated you to get into this line of work?
Well, that's interesting. I'm an accidental expert on the topic. I was originally studying the German apprenticeship system as a comparative education professor, and then one of the schools that I was doing work in, 18 months of field work for a dissertation project, which became a book, had a very high number of neo-Nazis at that time, and so and there had been a surge in far-right extremism, and so teachers, I was studying the civics teachers, were really committed to trying to prevent what was happening, trying to persuade students of more democratic and inclusive ideas and prevent the use of violence. And so I became this accidental expert on school-based responses to resurgent hate and anti-Semitism. And I wrote 2 books on the German context as a comparative education professor, not really thinking I was relevant to an American context. And after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, so almost 10 years ago, I started getting asked to testify and explain things to American audiences and advise tech companies on youth culture related to hateful ideas, and that's how this all began.
Wow, that's quite the shift.
Yes, it is completely.
Yeah. So you did a couple trainings this morning. Can you tell me about those?
Yeah, so we've been doing, I run a research lab now that has about 35 people in it, and we design, test, and then try to scale up tools to help safeguard communities online and help prevent manipulation to sort of propaganda, conspiracy theories, harmful content that people might encounter, and keep everybody safer. And so we have funding from the Lumina Foundation to do a number of trainings on manipulative content online related to gender and influencers who are sort of exploiting vulnerabilities among young men and trying to persuade them of beliefs that are things like it's okay to hit women or women shouldn't have the right to vote. And so we have a number of trainings like that, and then we use that as an anchor to create a broader social media outreach and manipulation training, which is the one that we did today here at Elon. And so we're still sort of testing and refining, so we're asking students for a lot of feedback and been getting a lot of great responses and discussions about kind of what types of emotions you experience when you are on your own feed and who's trying to use those emotions maybe to profit.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think that these manipulation trainings specifically apply to college students, and how are they relevant?
Yeah, the college students are such a great demographic to work with because a lot of them have younger siblings, and so one of the demographics we're actually most worried about are kind of 11 to 14-year-olds, 14, 15-year-olds, and a lot of college students have kids in their lives who are that age, cousins, younger siblings. And so they often come into these trainings thinking about the vulnerabilities that the younger relatives in their life have, but they're also worried about their parents and grandparents. And so we actually have this demographic question about who are they most worried about, and they come last of the people they're worried about, which is actually we should all be thinking about that. Everyone can be vulnerable to manipulation, but they're really, in this group, more worried about in this demographic, younger siblings and older relatives than they are about themselves in terms of manipulation. So we do want to educate everybody about the kind of manipulation they might be susceptible to, but we also know that college students are great kind of replicators of information for their family members. And they're going to go out soon into the work world and also be a little more vulnerable to financial scams or insurance scams or something, because all of that stuff you're adulting maybe for the first time, and so it's a vulnerable moment. And that 18 to 29-year-old bracket, one of the things we cover, actually falls prey more often to those kinds of manipulation than older generations do. So it's a good time to help people become more skeptical of what they're consuming.
Yeah, and were you surprised by that finding that college students aren't as worried about themselves?
I was surprised, yeah. I mean, a little bit. We also find that with parents. We do a lot of work with parents, and the more highly educated parents are the like they don't think they need help because they think that they can already recognize online manipulation, and they're wrong usually, right, about the kinds of stuff that their kids encounter. So once they do a training, they actually decline in confidence. And so it's one of the things we learned is that, like, you're not always trying to increase everybody's confidence. Sometimes you're trying to correct their overconfidence that they already know what they're doing. And I think that's probably true for almost all people who have a lot of education or are in education, because education alone doesn't prevent you from being manipulated. It's a different kind of information literacy and sort of skepticism. So, but I also think, college students are, they're around a lot of peers that, what we see is they're more worried about their peers, they're more worried about younger siblings, they're more worried about their parents and about older relatives than they are about themselves. The biggest group they're worried about is society at large. And so, I think it's a lesson to remember that it's like a self-care lesson. Like, you also have to pay attention to your own emotions when you're scrolling social media and not just worry about others.
Yeah, and then pivoting a little bit, you're doing a talk this evening. Can you tell me a little bit about what you plan to talk about?
Yeah, so I'm giving a talk on my most recent book, which is called Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, in which I link a lot of things that my side of the field in the national security space has really been overlooking and neglecting. So one of the things we know is that the top predictor, or among the top 3 predictors of support for political violence and willingness to engage in it, is misogyny or hostile sexism, depending on how the survey defines it. That's across multiple surveys. But still, I often have journalists saying, well, what can we do about rising political violence, right? And I often say, well, we could look at the data, right? Maybe we could address these issues of sort of misogyny and violence against women. We also know that 60% of all mass attackers in the US since 1949 had a documented history of domestic and intimate partner violence. And yet that gets really ignored on my side of the field. So I wrote the book to kind of draw attention to the through line between ordinary and everyday forms of gender-based violence, assault, misogyny, and school shootings, mass shootings, political violence, hate-fueled violence, terrorist attacks, in an effort to show that there are earlier ways to prevent and off-ramp people who are exhibiting signs we should be concerned about, including gender-based harms.
Yeah, and how do you recommend kind of confronting those smaller gender-based harms before they escalate?
Yeah, so one of the things is to be alert to a lot of online misogyny right now, which is in a documented way has been rising since 2011, and I think a lot of women in your generation in particular describe it as the cost of doing business online, just the cost of being online, is that you confront a constant and steady stream of sexually violent comments, gender policing, comments about appearance, right? It's just a constant, like catcalling, except it's all the time online, anytime there's a post. And so, and then a lot of times it's dismissed as just a joke. I was just joking, stop being a snowflake, stop being so triggered, stop being so woke, you can't say anything anymore, you can't even joke. And so one is to be more aware of that, and also for men who might participate in it and think that they're joking or just look away when their friends do it. And so kind of being more aware and standing up to it and saying that's not cool. And also, I think being aware of how all of us are affected by it are sort of 2 major strategies. In the field of prevention, we also urge thinking about how manipulators and profiteers are using these things to get votes, and on any side of the political spectrum to get votes, but also to try and profit, by getting you to sign up for a course or buy a product or subscribe to something.
Yeah. And are there different ways that you kind of present this topic and those potential solutions to younger audiences, college students versus older adults?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that the training, for example, that we did today, which is on social media and outrage, manipulation, sort of people who are trying to peddle outrage for their own profit and how easy it is to be influenced by that. It's very interactive, so we ask people to pull out their phones and scroll on their reels, like on Insta or TikTok or even YouTube, and that would be something different with an elderly audience. So I do give a lot of talks to grandparents where I talk to them a little bit differently about why I think grandparents are particularly good interlocutors with younger kids and teens. But I urge them to sort of ask questions about teenagers' feeds and sort of like ask how Instagram works. I don't understand these different symbols. What do they mean? How do you use it? How do you communicate with images? And we urge them to use curiosity and not judgment. And then you can have conversations like, how often do you see something that makes you uncomfortable? Or how often do you see something from someone you didn't subscribe to follow, right? Or you're not one of your friends. Violent content, accidentally viewing pornography or child abuse or harmful abuse, which almost every middle schooler and high schooler that I talk to, and high schools and middle schools a lot, have seen, right, by accident. And when I ask them how it makes them feel, they say like numb or apathetic. And so helping older adults understand what their kids' lives are like, I think, is a huge leap toward starting to have solutions that aren't just about cell phone bans, which might help with screen-free childhoods, but aren't what kids actually want, which are places to talk about it that are safe and non-judgmental.
Mm-hmm. And with like all of this kind of stuff appearing on social media now, that's very different than when those adults were young.
Yeah.
Do you expect that to be something that keeps on evolving and changing?
Yes, I think it constantly evolves and changes, and so there will always be, it's one of the reasons why I love that our lab is in a university, because we have a very young team, and you need that, right? We need a young team who's highly online to help us understand, us older generation folks understand like what's coming, what's happening, what are the trends. I mean, we do a lot of mapping of harmful content that what we call is emergent, meaning it's about to move from the fringes, really dark spaces, into the mainstream. And so we often are watching in real time as like a looks-maxing influencer suddenly shows up in the New York Times style section, like what happened last weekend. Someone who advocates for really harmful habits for boys to achieve maximum attractiveness, as he describes it, right? Like smashing your jaw with a hammer in order to get microfractures. That's not scientifically safe or proven to have any effect on getting a stronger jawline, but yet boys are doing it and disfiguring themselves. And so we track that kind of stuff as it comes. That came out of a community called the incel community, which are violent, involuntary celibates who often scapegoat and blame or fearmonger girls and women for not giving them the attention or physical intimacy that they think they're entitled to. So that's made it into the mainstream now in very big ways, and so that's always going to change. The platforms will change, the tactics will change, the things that are emergent will change, and so we will constantly need a younger generation to keep us fresh. And I think we need people my age too who can talk to parents and grandparents in really relatable ways and say like, look, I know this is hard. Like, I have teenagers. It's hard to talk to your teenagers. You can also talk to other kids in the carpool. You can listen. There are ways you have an impact on the soccer team or around the dinner table that are important.
Mm-hmm. And for going back to, you said that university students are most worried about society at large. What would you say to them if they're worried about society?
I mean, I think it's really interesting to see like that they put themselves last and society first, right? And they are society, right? So like, but I think it goes back to that feeling of like, I couldn't be the one. I'm less worried about myself being manipulated than I am about my peers, right? Because you have more confidence about yourself. But it is easy, especially with AI, to not know if something's real or not, if it's fake, if it's, if something is contacting you with an AI-generated voice that's actually a relative's voice asking for help, right? All of this stuff is getting harder and harder to detect. So I think one thing is for us all to realize, like, none of us are immune to it. Even I study it, I'm not immune to it. Like, so it's easy to fall for these scams, and so not judging yourself, but also not being overconfident about it. So I would tell them, start with yourself, start with the people close to you. We also think that college students have tremendous power with high school students and with younger siblings, and so we really urge peer-to-peer stuff can be hard. Sometimes it works, but it's much easier, even with college seniors and college freshmen or college students in a local high school. So start with where you are, right? Like, it can feel really hopeless if you just think like society's doomed. But if you think like society is made up of all of us, and I can have an impact here on the Girls and Boys Club that I volunteer in, or in my job at the ice cream parlor where like I have a couple high school students there, you can actually have a pretty big impact by having those conversations. I have students who have already had a huge impact just from these kind of conversations that we've had with kids they babysit, which is pretty amazing. Like, two 10-year-olds told one of my students after a conversation with her, they voluntarily decided to stop watching YouTube shorts, right? Like, I don't know if it stuck, but like, they were just like, actually, we realize this stuff is really bad. Once they started reflecting, like she was just asking, how often do you see stuff that makes you uncomfortable? And they were describing it, and then they're like, actually, why are we watching this stuff? And they only were allowed 1 hour a day. You know, they had screen limits and restrictions from their parents. And so then they were just like, you know what, we should do something else with our time. And so everyone can have an impact, and I think that's actually a hopeful message. If you realize it's everywhere, if the problem is everywhere, then every one of us can do something about it.
Yeah, so starting small is
that's society, right? If everyone starts small, then society starts to have change.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, great questions. I would just say, I think it's, I think that the idea that prevention is possible is really important to convey. I mean, we tend to think of prevention of violence, and I'll say this tonight, in this country as about building better fences and more security that is about barricading the doors. And I think what our lab is trying to do is show that there are also ways to prevent harms in a much more upstream way, like we do with public health, with educating people about healthy eating habits or exercise habits that can lead to reduced diabetes, with getting better walking trails, reducing food deserts. Like, all of those things have parallels in the online ecosystems, with teaching digital media literacy, with advocating for social media companies to have more accountability, for regulation, and for awareness raising. And so I think that what you're doing is great to get the word out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.